Well, of course, nobody believed him. We didn't believe it at all. Well, came down to the fact that we had, I think, 6 more games or 7 more games with Brooklyn, and we beat Brooklyn the 6 or 7 more, finally wound up beating them 13 straight in the exhibition games. And we got off to a fairly good start in the spring of 26, and we won, I think, 12 straight or 16 straight at the beginning of the year. And after that was over, Ruth said, I told you guys in spring training we'd win this pennant. And by George, we wound up the 26th season winning the pennant just as Ruth anticipated or predicted. And the fellow was remarkable. He could pick pennant races closer to anything else, any other fellow in the country. And I always wondered how Ruth, I read, of course, about Ruth sitting up temporarily yesterday and having a small respite from his condition, and he sat up for a while yesterday, I understand, and I just wonder what was passing through the big boy's mind. I mean, he was always uncanny in his predictions, just like pointing to center field up there in Chicago and hitting the ball off route into the center field bleachers, and he was that way. And I just thought that I was sitting here while I was broadcasting tonight, and I was thinking to myself, could it have been possible that Babe knew that he just had one more day to live? And I wonder what his thoughts were, down through the years, down through the ages. And if he remembered and all these things that happened to him in the past came back to life. Thinking way back in Jacksonville in 1920, when he hit that ball across the racetrack in 1920, and they went out there and measured it, and they measured some 500 and some odd feet. The time that he hit the fire barrel up in the top of the right field section of the grandstand, right field bleachers in the Yankee Stadium. That was in the last row of a very huge bleachers. It would have carried far, far over the right field bleachers here at Crosley Field. And the home run that he hit over the roof, that was in left field too, in the White Sox Park. I don't forget the year though, but it was over the left center field roof, and that stand is double-decked and it stands back there quite a distance. Then the time in Chicago that Mark Roth, who was also dead, whom I mentioned earlier, rushed down to the bench and said to Miller Huggins, Miller, if we don't get this game over pretty quickly, we're going to miss that train for New York. And this was around 6:30 or 6:45 at night, and Babe was just picking up a bat, and he turned around to Mark Roth and he says, it was the 13th inning, he said, I'll get the ball game over for you, Mark. And he went up to the plate and hit the ball into the right field seats on the first pitch and put us ahead, and Pennock held him in the last of the 13th, and we won the ball game. Babe, people want to know whether Babe was superstitious and whether he alibied. Yes, Babe was superstitious, and he did alibi a lot. There wasn't any doubt about that. When he'd get in a slump, he'd look for little things to bring him out of it, little things to satisfy his ego, I suppose. He wouldn't, naturally, when he was in a slump, Babe had that type of ego. He wasn't a swell-headed guy. He just had that super ego as a hitter, and consequently, when he'd get in a slump, he wouldn't blame his own ability. He wanted to look around to blame it on the first thing that came within his attention, I guess. For instance, you never knew that Ruth was a great snuff taker. He used snuff to a great extent. He used to use some snuff called Copenhagen, and he put that snuff up his nose, and when he would sneeze afterwards, it sounded like Ferdinand the Bull. But at any rate, he came in the clubhouse in the Yankee Stadium one time, and he said he had a pain in his stomach. Oh, he had a very bad pain in his stomach. So he went up to Doc Woods, our trainer. He was in a bad slump right at this time, and he wasn't hitting much. And he went up to Doc Woods, our trainer, and he said, Woody, he said, what have you got for pain in the stomach? So Woody said, well, I might give you a little bicarbonate of soda, babe. He said, only Woody called it bicarb. I'll give you a little bicarb, babe. And Babe said, what's that bicarb stuff? And Woody said, why, babe, he said, that's just a little powder I mix up in water, and he said, it'll relieve the congestion in your stomach. You'll feel a little better. And Babe said, all right, fix me up a jug of that stuff. So Babe went down a mug of bicarbonate of soda, and I guess it had the desired effect because he felt better immediately, and he went out and he hit a home run. Well, ever after that, he insisted on a drink of bicarbonate of soda before every ball game because he considered it I guess he considered it lucky. You know, Ruth would never eat in the main dining room, not because he was snooty or anything like that, but people used to bother him so much that he never could get time to eat or never get his dinner down. Of course, they do say Ping Bodie used to room with him back. He was the one that coined the expression. Ping Bodie used to room with him way back in the early 20s. Ping was quite a character himself. Ping Bodie, I don't know if you remember him or not. A little Italian fellow up in the coast, little round man, looked like a billiken, but they were a great pair, Ruth and Bodie. And one day, somebody wanted to know whether Ping was rooming with Ruth, and Ping says, "For goodness sakes, no." He says, "I only room with his suitcase." But there, we developed a superstition on the Yankees about rooming with Ruth. Later on, nobody would room with him because all the fellows like Ping Bodie, Bobby Roth, Chick Buster, and these different roommates that he had from time to time, Jimmy Reese, Billy Werber, I don't know that Billy Werber roomed with him or not, Jimmy Reese, but they were all let go. I mean, Ruth would last, but the roommates didn't. So nobody wanted to room with Ruth because they were superstitious about that. All these stories, though, about the Big Babe and about his home runs. He hit a home run in Detroit. He hit it over the right field fence. Well, the ball happened to land in the passageway to a street out there and continued on downtown. Somebody chased it on a bicycle. They said that was the longest home run ever hit. Now, that's serious. I mean, somebody wrote in one time when I told that story, said something about a home run being hit into a boxcar, and they closed the door in the boxcar, and the train started, and the home run went all the way to Milwaukee or something. Well, I mean, that's more or less of a joke, but this one was hit over the right field fence and rolled down this street, and some kid chased it on a bicycle. And Ruth would give a kid $5 if he brought around a home run ball that he got in the street, because Ruth saved all those balls, and he'd give the kid $5 and a pair of passes. Somebody one time wanted to know about the home runs hit out here at Crosley Field in around 1921 when the Yankees came here to Crosley Field to play an exhibition game. I understand that the home plate in those days was some perhaps 40 feet behind where it is at the present time, and Ruth hit the ball over the center field wall, which was in those days was quite a feat. Now, I don't know that to be true. Somebody said you were with the Yankees at the time, so why would you know that? Well, I tell you this, people are under a little the home plate was 21 feet further back than it is at the present time. But you see, when the Yankees went on an exhibition cover, they stopped off. Now, for instance, the Yankees might come from New York to come to Cincinnati to play an exhibition game and then hop a train for Chicago after the game. Well, they'd send just the required amount of pitchers to pitch the exhibition game, and the other pitchers wouldn't come to the exhibition town. They'd be sent on ahead to the town that the team was going to open in. So I wasn't here. I didn't see Ruth do that back in 1921, but they tell me he parked a couple. But to show you uncanny things, too, I mentioned this the other day on a broadcast. This might be repetitious for somebody else, but I don't know. I think it was Barnhart. If it was Barnhart or... Anyway, it was a third baseman for Pittsburgh, and the Yankees were playing an exhibition game in Pittsburgh. That was the days in the old park, and the right field fence was a tremendous distance from the home plate. That was before the right field pavilion was erected and cut off part of right field. And Ruth was a big hero in those days, and of course, everybody wanted to see what made the big guy tick. So he didn't hit a home run. They had 26,000 out for this exhibition game, and it was more or less of a joke game. Everybody was having a good time, more or less. But Ruth didn't hit any home runs in this game this particular day, and the last time at bat, why, whoever was pitching, I don't forget who it was, Lee Meadows, and I forget who the pitcher was over there, but nevertheless, they got 2 strikes from Ruth. They pitched him another ball, and Ruth popped it up. And it was a foul fly outside of third base, and whoever the third baseman was went over there under the ball. It wasn't Pye's Trainer. It was before Trainer arrived in Pittsburgh. But dropped the ball deliberately. Being good sport, this third baseman for Pittsburgh realized that the fans had come out to see Ruth hit a home run, and he was going to give the Babe another chance if possible. Now, if you're a ball player, you understand that even if you lob the ball up to the plate, it's very difficult to hit a ball a long way, probably more difficult than if you don't know what's coming, because it makes you over-anxious. And just to say that they laid one in there for any particular batter they hit doesn't mean that the batter can hit it. That is, out of the park. It's really a tremendous feat, even if you know what's on the ball, or how fast it's going to be thrown, or what it's going to do to hit it out of the park. That's not always possible. So this third baseman dropped the ball deliberately. It was just an exhibition game. Everybody had a good laugh. And they allowed Babe to take another swing. Babe hit the ball, a country mile over the right field fence in Pittsburgh when it was way back. And you can imagine how that thrilled the people over there, because that's the type of a feat that couldn't be done couldn't be done once out of 100 times, even if you knew what was coming. Well, somebody else suggested that I talk about my trip to Japan with the Babe. I didn't go on to Japan with Babe. Babe went some 10 years later. He went around 1922. That was Gehrig and Babe and Simmons and that bunch went over there with Babe. I didn't go on that trip. I went back in 1922. But you know, Babe, on that trip, I'll tell you a hot story about that. Over in Japan, I was up in Ruth's apartment one night. Well, get this. I was up in Ruth's apartment one night, and Ruth was telling me about the trip to Japan and China, and he was telling me about the time down in his travels down in the Philippine Islands. And he kept on talking, and if you'd heard the big fella talk, you could understand what I'm trying to explain to you. But anyway, he was sitting up there, and he was saying, we were down there in the Philippine Islands, he says, and those Hawaiians down there, he says, why, they gave us a pretty good game. And then Mrs. Ruth would stop the conversation, and she would say to the Babe, not Hawaiians, Babe, Filipinos. And Babe said, all right then, Filipinos. And he says, so we were down there in the Philippine Islands, and he says, there was Gomez and myself and Earl Whitehill and the rest, and he says, and those Hawaiians, and Mrs. Ruth would say, not Hawaiians, Babe, Filipinos. And Babe said, all right, Filipinos. He says, we played him out there one day. He said they had kind of a fresh pitcher pitching for him. He said he was going to get out the big Babe Ruth, and he said, finally, I hit one off and hit it over the center field wall. He says, but those Filipinos, he said, those Hawaiians, he says, they were pretty, and she says, not, Babe, for the third time, not Hawaiians, Filipinos, Babe. And he says, Filipinos? What the heck's the difference? He says, why does it make any difference? I hit the home run, didn't I? So he's telling also about New Year's Eve, I believe it was, in Manila Harbor, and they had the American boat was docked, and they were going to have this party on the boat, and the boat was to sail that night, and there was Mrs. Gomez, Lefty Gomez, and Mrs. Gomez, and Mrs. Gomez had the seat to the left of the Babe, and they were passing caviar, and every time that the caviar was passed, why, it seemed that Babe said, gee whiz, says, every time that caviar bowl was passed, he says, get her to come around to the left, he says, and he says, get to Mrs. Gomez, and Mrs. Gomez says she'd scoop out that caviar, he says, she'd drop it on that plate there, and by George, every time that bowl got to me, it was empty. He says, why, that Mrs. Gomez says, he used to tell this to Lefty, he says, Lefty, he says, that wife of his, he says, she would eat that caviar like a seagull eating fish. He says, she'd just go, gallup, gallup, gallup. And he said, down would go all the caviar. I said, I never even got a spoonful all night long. But he was a master. There wasn't any doubt about it. I always remember St. Louis. And what fun he used to have. The Babe was just a big overgrown kid. Just a big, good-natured guy, and carried that sort of spirit right on all through his life. He used to like spare ribs a great deal. And down in St. Louis, why, whenever we leave St. Louis, we used to leave from a little station out of town, and the Babe would always send some messenger of his ahead in a taxi cab, and he knew some German woman down there in St. Louis who used to cook up these spare ribs. And boy, I'll say they were good, but he used to order racks and racks and racks and racks of spare ribs, and she used to send them down cooked in cartons down to the Bremen Avenue, I believe it was, the train down there, and then he'd hold forth in the compartment on the train, and he'd sell these spare ribs at a half a dollar a rack to the ball players. He wouldn't give you any, he'd make you buy them. But all the ball players would rather eat the spare ribs than go in the dining car, and Babe was worried. So, gee whiz, fellow's got to get even on this thing, doesn't he? Well, nevertheless, he loved these spare ribs. He'd sit there in the hole, he'd just chew on those things, and what a time he had. But his later years, I don't know whether he was spent in lowliness or not. Sometimes I think maybe his heart was a little bit broken because he never landed back in baseball. I could sit here and tell you story after story. There's so many of them. As I said at the beginning of the talk, Ruth and Gehrig were opposite as the poles. They were much different in character. And Ruth was a little burned up at Gehrig at one time because Ruth took Gehrig on an exhibition tour and signed him for one of these exhibition tours and paid Gehrig, I think it was $15,000 or $20,000 for this exhibition tour. And on this tour, why, it seems that Gehrig, Ruth always claimed that he knew how to get the money. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. But nevertheless, he exacted some kind of a promise out of Gehrig that Gehrig wouldn't sign a contract with the Yankees until he talked it over with Ruth. Ruth felt that Gehrig was underpaid. But nevertheless, Gehrig popped up signing his contract in New York and didn't say a word to Babe about it. And Babe said, told a lot of us later, he said, "Oh, the devil with that guy. I'm not going to do anything about him anymore. He can go his own way now." There wasn't actually any open enmity between the two. They liked each other, for that matter, but nevertheless, they weren't the pals that they were before then. Don't you think that Ruth didn't show Gehrig a lot about hitting?
I must say this, one of the great things was watching Ruth's development, not alone as a ball player, but as a man and as a character. He grew in stature each year. He started from nothing, as you know. And as each year went by, Ruth added a little. Not that he was particularly cultured. He wasn't. He didn't know some of what we call the higher forms of culture. But he did learn some of the social graces, not to any large degree. But he was certainly a different man than when I first saw him up in Boston. When I first saw him with the Red Sox, he, I guess, didn't weigh over 192 pounds, if he weighed that, and rather thin for Babe. Really, they always talk about his toothpick ankles. Actually, his ankles were bigger than my own. But he was so big in frame, over the rest of him, made his ankles look slim. But up there in Boston, he was just a young fellow, and all this was piling in on him, and he didn't just know from nothing, as the expression goes. He didn't know how much he should be paid as a young fellow. He didn't know. All he wanted to do is play ball. He just lived for baseball, just lived for it. I often think that if the Yankees hadn't paid him $85,000, he'd have played for nothing. He was that kind of a fellow. He'd rather play baseball than eat. He loved the game, and he loved to find out new things, and it was just a pleasure for him to go out and swing that big bat. And, he didn't demand any special privileges. I saw Ruth in the clubhouse after one World Series when word came down from the front office that some young fellow shouldn't get a full share or should only get a quarter share. Saw Ruth stand up on his feet and argue for this young kid, and I don't think he even knew the kid's name. And Ruth argued that kid should get a full share of the World Series, and by George, the kid got it. And we used to like to go to church with him on Sunday. Ruth would go to church, and he'd have a regular troop going after him because the Protestants and on the club and some of the Catholics, and they'd all go alike with Babe, because Babe would give it the gesture grand when he's in church. When they passed the plate, he'd whip out a $50 bill, and half the church knew by the way Ruth put that 50 in the plate that it was a $50 bill going in there. And then when after church was over, that was the sight, because then Ruth would stand on the steps and autograph different things for a half an hour or more. And say, speaking of that autographing business, that's actually true. I mean, about the Babe being such a good guy with all the youngsters and with all the fans. I mean, Ruth never lost patience with the fans. He was never was too busy to do something for the fans. Naturally, there are some pests around all the time in baseball and show business, other things like that. But they're not just the once in a while people. They're the guys that always wanted to get something out of Ruth, trying to use him for a good thing. But Babe would, I know another big star in that ball club that used to sneak through the center field fence to avoid the kids and the fans after the ball game was over. But Babe would come right out the clubhouse door, and he'd stand there, and as many cards as there were, as many kids as there were, and as many grown people as there were, he'd stand there autographing whatever there were until it was over. Well, then later on, it got a little burdensome for him. And then because the kids would pick up little papers, any little scrap paper in the street, and autograph. He wanted the kids to pick up these little dirty papers and want him to autograph it. Wasn't any purpose behind it. There wasn't anything except to say that they got Babe's autograph. It wasn't even that purposeful. It was more or less just to have something to do. So later on, Babe would only autograph scorecards, scorebooks, baseballs, and mementos that he knew that the people considered of some value. He was never too tired to do those kind of things. This moving picture that they made about him. Now, I understand, I don't know, I haven't seen the picture myself, so I shouldn't be in the position of a critic. I'm not a movie critic. I don't know anything about it, except they say they overplay this business of Babe going to the hospital and visiting so many kids. He did go to the hospital, and he did visit kids. But the time that he was fined and suspended in St. Louis, don't get the impression that he was fined and suspended for anything that was like missing the ball game. That because he was running to the hospital for some kid's dog. That's not true. I mean, let's have the truth about this thing. He just misbehaved in St. Louis and got fined. And that's all there was about it. And to make matters worse, when he finally got home after being fined $5,000, his chauffeur had run into somebody and caused an accident that cost him $2,000 more. And those were kind of dog days for the Babe. And I read a piece the other day speaking about him giving a banquet way back around 22 or sometime in there. It might have been later on that they said he did. And acted very contrite about the whole thing. The year he gave the banquet was in the winter of 1925. And like a big kid, he stood up there in the banquet in front of all these sports writers because he had been getting over cocky and he had been riding the chutes, as you might say, and overplaying everything. And he practically stood up there and cried and said that he was going to be a better boy and all this kind of thing, like a big kid. But the nice thing about Ruth is that he did it. And he had enough willpower and enough guts about the whole thing to turn over a new leaf, and he actually did, and he became more popular than ever. There's a funny story about that, too. You know, at one time in Chicago, a little later on, Miller Huggins, our manager, had thought that there was some possibilities of Babe was kind of chasing around a little again, and they thought maybe Babe was going to kick over the traces. And so Miller Huggins went to Mark Roth. He says, Mark, he said, by George, Mark was the traveling secretary. He said, by George, Mark, he said, you know, if the Babe gets out of hand again, he said, I'm going to have to fine him again. It's going to be drastic. Well, Mark says, is that so? When? He said, now? Oh, no, Huggins says, no, I'll have to wait and see. So that night, I guess Babe overstayed the curfew again. He stayed out. We used to have a 1 o'clock rule. He stayed out after 1 o'clock, and next day out there at the clubhouse, Miller Huggins said to Mark Roth again, I guess today's the day I got to sock it to the big guy again. And Roth said, this afternoon? He said, no, I guess tonight. I'll have to get after him tonight. Babe didn't get out there on time for batting practice. He showed up about a half hour late after our batting practice was over. In the ball game, he hit 2 home runs and got a couple of other hits. When they got back to the hotel after dinner, Mark Roth, the secretary, and Miller Huggins, the manager, were sitting together in the hotel lobby. Down comes the Babe in white pants and a blue coat and a fancy-looking necktie and all dolled up. He's going out again. And Mark Roth hit Miller Huggins a punch in the ribs. He said, you going to find him now? Now? Well, Huggins got thinking about those 2 home runs and those 4 hits. He said, I'll go on with you. He couldn't find the guy again. Well, he was a great man. A great man. Fans, just this. It isn't the exploits. Don't think that I am sitting here, please, talking to you, marveling alone at the exploits, so that I'm building the Babe up or trying to build him up just for his exploits alone. That isn't quite it. He really, if you knew him well, he was a fascinating character. There isn't any doubt about it. I think he's one of the most, I wouldn't know, I mean about all the fascinating characters in the world, but certainly he's one of the most outstanding of his time. He's one of the most outstanding men of his time. You'd have to know him to appreciate it. I've told that to ball players. I've told that to ball players on other clubs who didn't know him. We always said that about the Babe when we were playing with him. We'd go around and talk about him to other ball players. In the American League, we'd talk about him. Then when some of the fellows, you'd meet some of the National League fellows, and they wouldn't believe it. They'd say, oh, he's just a guy that hits the ball a long way. All he can do is hit a ball. But when you're in his presence and you're around him a lot, and you see the things that occur in his daily life from early morning to late at night, and you could walk into a room, and you knew just as well, just the moment you stepped across the threshold, that you know it's you'd always know or feel that there was some great presence in the room because he had that magnetism. And you know, Babe wasn't particularly good looking. He, as they say, handsome. He wasn't particularly a handsome fellow, but there was a certain ruggedness about him that made him attractive to people. And although his talk was particularly rugged at times, nevertheless the women seemed to like him. Everybody that met him seemed to be drawn to him because he had a warm personality. He really had kind brown eyes, and you look at the big guy and you think, well, by George, it's one of those kind of things you couldn't get mad at, as if you had a big dog that kind of tore up things around the house, then he'd give you those sad eyes, and you couldn't do anything to your dog. You just couldn't take a sock at him because the dog would look at you with those soulful eyes, and what could you do about it? The big guy was like that. He was like that wherever he went, and the people he met, and the things that he did. And he just led one hectic life from the time it started, I guess, until 1 minute after 7 this evening. Oh, I'd like to say so much. I can't go overboard too much, and I've talked to you now for 50 minutes, I believe, almost 50 minutes. It just pains me that the big guy is gone. It's kind of a... What can you say? You just say a sad farewell to the fellow. But he's lived his life. He entertained a lot of people in his life, brought happiness to a lot of people, and I guess he was happy himself. Let's put it that way. He led a happy life, got to a point far beyond anything he ever dreamed of, I guess, as a kid. But I know his pleasure was to entertain people, and he derived a lot of satisfaction out of it. There are many, many stories. The stories are inexhaustible that you can tell about Ruth. I'm sure I could sit here but you see, I don't like to leave dead spots in the air. I'd have to think back and rack my memory, and that wouldn't please you, I suppose. But I've talked a good deal now about him, and I've been on the air since 7:30 tonight. So, fans, you'll hear more about it, and you'll read a lot about it. But just understand this, no matter what you read or hear, there was never one like Babe Ruth. There will never be one again. Ever. Ever. There might be fellows that'll break his home run record, but they won't have the other side of him. There might be fellows that'll have the other side of him that won't break his home run record. And I say that I never saw him make a mistake on the ball field. You might think that's exaggerated. I never did, and I played 10 years with him and 5 years against him. Played in 6 World Series with him, and I've seen him do a lot of things. And you'll never understand just how remarkable that fellow was. There'll never be another Babe Ruth, not while I live. I don't think while you live. Well, I hope it wasn't too tough for him when he went out this evening. Finally got him, didn't they? Pretty tough guy to get out, but they finally got him. Well, fans, good night to you all. Thank you for listening. We're going to dispense with the burger commercial tonight, or the burger jingle at the end. And just not so much for you fans. I don't want to be... I hope you'll share it with me. Let's put it that way, please. But I'm just going to ask Dick Woods on the control board in there if he, just for the old Babe, won't play Auld Lang Syne. Good night, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard a great ball player, Wade Hoyt, pay tribute to the greatest of them all, Babe Ruth. This is the Burger Beer Baseball Network.